Welcome to Let's Talk Cardano, presented by the Cardano Foundation. In each episode, we delve deep into the transformative world of blockchain technology. Join us as we explore how blockchain is reshaping industries from finance to supply chain and talk with some of the key pioneers at the forefront of this revolution. All right here on Let's Talk Cardano. In this episode, Alex Appledorn delves into the world of Web 3.0 with Yats, the visionary behind Mocha brands. During this insightful discussion, the two explore the impact of blockchain technology, the rise of digital ownership in the metaverse, and the future of online communities.
I've recently sort of been actually looking at some of your interviews, and one of the things that I was very curious about, because you have a training in classical music, if I'm not mistaken.
I do. Yes.
Yes. Right. I was wondering, obviously with your passion of fair distribution of wealth, and maybe your background in music, is that where that came from, or does that play a role today?
I mean, I think my childhood definitely played a role in this, but I think it's a combination of things, right? Okay. My mom was a professional musician, and really she was always taking advantage of when it came to things like money. She didn't understand it, so that was kind of part of that lesson. But the other one is, I'm a little older, so I grew up at a time when there was still basically East and West Europe. Yeah. And at that time, my mom used to work at the eastern side of Berlin, so at the Komische Oper. So I would visit her, and I would see basically what a world would look like that was basically truly communist, right? Wow. And so that gave me had a lasting impression. And of course, I didn't know as a child back then how it would impact me in the future, but it definitely left a lasting impression on that. And then afterwards, moving to America, I actually got to see what actually capitalism really looked like, because whatever capitalism we had in Europe was nothing of the sort, right? Because Austria had more of a, I guess, socially democratic country, really was much less capitalist in its construction. And then from the US, I came to Hong Kong, which is basically sort of Milton Friedman's wet dream, right? It's completely uber capitalist. And at the time when I went there wasn't even social security, right? Oh, wow. It was that extreme, right? So I got to see that whole range. And I would say that kind of informed me later in life about sort of the concepts of what I think would be a fair distribution. I'm not talking about being equal, right? Because that would be communism in a way, right? But rather, how do we make it more fair for everyone? Because when you think about sort of capitalism, to create a free and fair market, you actually need to have sort of fair rules, and basically you need to have an open marketplace, which is actually something that doesn't always happen, right? And I think this is why I got so attracted in the potential of Web3 and blockchain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is probably like in the last 2 decades or so, in, for instance, the systems like Spotify, in which they started out as this idea of a free marketplace in which the artists were properly paid. As time evolved in a centralizing power, you see that more and more money is essentially going to platforms like Spotify and less to actual artists.
And I think this is what's so attractive about the power of decentralization, because decentralization to me isn't about anarchy, right? That some people, when they hear that word, they go, oh, like everyone is chaos, right? To me, it's more about sort of the distribution of power, because when you have the distribution of power, then actually what you have is an actual market that's really competing for your attention in a sort of a much more free and fair way. Yeah. And I think that's the issue that Spotify had. Actually, the music industry had this earlier with ASCAP. Yeah. Right? ASCAP basically was the royalty collecting, non-profit entity for the musicians. And that was really important. Yeah. But then actually what happened is that they were basically centralizing all of the value because they were collecting all the money. And suddenly when they were collecting all the money, they had all the power, and then they started abusing it. And actually they had to be broken up. Yeah. And there was a whole antitrust lawsuit and so on, because essentially they were abusing their power. I think it goes sort of this age-old adage that, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that actually seems to be true almost every time. Yeah. And again, I think this is why decentralization is so beautiful, because you can't even get there, and therefore you won't be seduced to essentially abusing that position, right? Which is basically the promise of blockchain.
Yeah, it is always quite interesting how most of these companies start with good intentions and end with maybe less ideal situations.
I mean, most people don't even maybe recall that Facebook didn't grow because of Facebook. It grew because people built great apps on it. Like, for instance, Zinga's Farm Bill. Right?
Yeah.
Farm Bill actually made Facebook. And then when it started getting actually too big and maybe even bigger than Facebook itself, they started basically cutting them down, right?
Yeah.
But then they accrued all the benefits of the network effects and basically became the platform that they were. Meanwhile, at that point, Zinga almost went out of business, right? Yeah. I mean,
wow.
that's because, basically they went from, having all these sort of network effects to basically having that cut down and having almost none of their users, right? And revenue was collapsing at that point. It was a very, very difficult time for them.
Okay, yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, if you essentially get kicked off the Facebook platform with billions of users, and all of a sudden, that gets.
And at the time, they didn't really have billions of users. Right. This is the thing; they had maybe tens of millions of users, and then actually, Farmville brought more users in, right? So the point is that Farmville made Facebook, and then after it made them, Facebook's like, thank you, spit them out, don't need you anymore, right?
Yeah.
And we had that same experience ourselves, right? When we were an app developer, we were one of the biggest app developers on Apple back in 2011 to 2012. And then in 2000, actually it was early 2012, right? Apple basically just removed all of our apps, and they didn't really give us, other than you broke the rules. But we never really knew what happened. And here we are, right? Basically completely deplatformed because essentially some digital king said, we don't want you anymore. And that's again, sort of, when you have that power, actually you're also not accountable for your action. You can just do it, right?
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, one of the other interesting things that I'm seeing right now is it's not like in a decentralized form, right? But there are, let's say, game-based tokenizations and also like exchange of value. And actually what we see, I think it's like in the tune of like $300 billion of like just in-game exchange of value. How do you look at that development?
Well, I mean, I think there are two categories, right? One of them are the ones that are in the Web2 games, like people trading skins, like Counter-Strike skins and so on. That's not on-chain. Yeah. That's basically just existing people trading sort of skin assets, but they are all done on a platform that essentially controls it. And there were some cases where, people actually started market making these skins.
Yes.
And then they banned them, right? And so there's stuff like that, which wouldn't be possible in something like Web3. But in Web3, for instance, actually what you have, starting with NFTs, but then actually now also through the tokenization of these assets, basically game-related tokens or meme tokens related to games, all that kind of stuff, actually all part of that economy. And yes, you're right. I mean, when you add all of that together, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Yeah. And they create economies of scale. But the way that we like to think of it is they essentially create sort of a kind of social currency that's attached to it as well. Yeah. And they glue the communities together as well. Because, in the traditional sense, people might not think of money as a social system. Yeah. But actually, money is very much a social system. Yeah. And it is actually the kind of language that we all understand at a base level. And then it transacts and allows people from all over the world to transact with that particular game. And there's branding attached to it as well. Yeah. I mean, back in the pre-Euro days, right, the national currencies were actually a point of honor and pride for the nations because they were essentially the symbol of that, right? Yeah. Whether it's the Deutschmark or whether it's the shilling or, these were, or the franc, right? These are actually things where, you had some sense of identity. Yeah. And so when you received that currency, you weren't just receiving something that was of store of value. It was something that had social and cultural capital attached to it. And that's what we see basically with tokenization. And games are essentially these proponents of culture, and the tokenization of it is essentially just broadening that. So it becomes also a marketing system. When you launch a token, it's not just about the players in the game. It's about attracting new players into an ecosystem. And you launch them, whether it's on an exchange or decentralized exchange, actually becomes a marketing event where people sort of see what's going on. And the network effects aren't only utility, but they're also financial in effect.
Almost like the network value within that game associated with sort of like the community. It's this emerging culture almost, because what you see a lot in these systems is that they create a specific language almost in order to communicate with each other, which is, unless you're in the community, you wouldn't understand it. I find it a very fascinating thing how these things sort of like in cross-border can emerge. Like
yes. Well, I mean, if you look, for instance, at a high level, the way that we look at tokens is the way in which you can own pieces of a network effect. When we talk about ownership, what are we owning? Yeah. Right? It's not a piece of land or something physical. It's something virtual, but the virtual is actually a network effect. So, basically, if a person owning ADA, for instance, is actually now an owner of your network. Yeah. He's not an owner of an asset per se in terms of like some real estate, but he actually owns the network effect and the benefits of the network effects that can accrue based on how much this person owns, right? And so how do you measure the strength of a network effect? And that has to do with the strength of the connection itself. Yeah. So for instance, if you have people that don't use a network a lot, then the value of the network isn't that great, right? And to me, it's actually, when you think of it from a sort of country national perspective, there's a difference between someone who lives there and uses the infrastructure every day versus someone who visits it maybe, once every few months and is a tourist and comes in and out. Yeah. There, again, that person has certain value, but the other person is more valuable. And so more people of that type create deeper and stronger network effects. Yeah. And so that's actually when you think about game economies or any kind of token that you launch, how do you measure the strength of these network effects is how deep the relations are with those networks that come from them. And so the effect would be that you are attracted to go there because of, for instance, economic opportunities, right? And the economic opportunity comes again because there's a strong network. Yeah. And at the end of the day, when people think about Cardano, are you joining the Cardano community because, the foundation is doing great things? Or are you joining it because all these other people are using Cardano or doing things or talking about it or building products and services? Yeah. And the true measure of the success of a network is actually when you go there because of the third parties building stuff. Yeah. And that's also when decentralization truly takes effect, because then actually you're no longer based on what one company or one group or even one foundation does. It's actually the entire community. And that's why, by the way, in Web3, we always talk about community, right? Yeah. And to me, the translation of community is really sort of a measure of our network effects that we can create.
One of the interesting things is almost like the visionary or cultural cohesion in sort of like these networks, right? There's a maybe specifically in decentralization, there's a shared vision, but also a lot of discrepancies, right? Like everybody has like a different execution of the same vision almost. I find that very, very interesting.
I think what you're describing is a little bit of a belief system as well, right? And by the way, belief and culture as well are forms of network effects, right? I mean, they are also, some of them may be more shallow. Like for instance, if the underlying belief of something is gone, for instance, let's say if the security of, the blockchain was compromised, then that belief system completely crumbles and the whole network effect disappears, for example, right? Yeah. But we are secured by it through the technology, and therefore we can trust and believe in essentially the provenance of the digital property rights that are attached to it. Yeah. And therefore we can basically give it more value as a result of that, right? And these are the kind of things that happen when you have these network effects. And what I find amazing about blockchain generally is that you have multiple compounding network effects that range from the digital trust as actually a technological, cryptographically secured method, all the way down to belief systems that are almost, in some cases, even religious in construct, right? But then also when you think about things like NFT collections, there's a brand attachment to it that actually is a network effect too, right? I mean, if you think about, for instance, the physical world, whether you buy a Rolex watch or you have a Birkin bag, for instance, or you have a Nike shoe, actually you're buying them because of their implied network effect and the status it might give to you, right? And so you're kind of wanting a little bit of that sort of, network effect dust going on you and saying, hey, I have this shoe, so I'm like cool or something, right? Yeah. And by the way, we see this in other areas as well. Like for instance, I know so many more people that are buying Garmin watches. I don't wear a watch, it's not me, right? But they're wearing Garmin watches, but they're not really athletic, right? But why do they do it? Because they want to be associated with that sense of, I'm an athletic guy. Exactly, right? And you have this also with drinks as well. I mean, I remember there's been sort of, having grown up in Austria, there's this big movement around the world for Red Bull, right? Oh, right, exactly. And again, that was sort of a brand association, but that network effect was, you drink Red Bull, I drink Red Bull. Yeah. and why was that? It was a connection, but also at the same time, it was an association that you're a certain type of, like more extreme sports guy or more adventurous person or high energy, whatever it is, right? So that's actually how these networks are constructed. And I think intrinsically, even sort of funny, silly, and sometimes very speculative things like meme coins emit the same feeling. And that's why I think some people intuitively sort of can feel it because it associates with them so clearly, right? Yeah. So that's what you're talking about right before, which is like, how do you create this connection? Actually, I already intrinsically, because of my background or my history or my my childhood, I have a connection with this, and therefore I'm more naturally drawn to it. And actually, you build a network from that. In the early days of the internet, we did this with chat groups and blogs, right? And there were so many that popped up, and some became big, and most didn't. Yeah. But we basically were garnering attention, and that's actually what's happening basically in Web3. Except now the attention has a financial element because you can trade it, which pre-Web3 you couldn't trade attention.
Do you think that maybe the bonds are stronger because there's a financial connection to it?
I think it becomes deeper, yes.
Okay.
But it also becomes riskier.
Yeah.
And by that concept, to me, what I like about it, and I think this is something that we're not fully yet in sort of knowing in the space, but when there's a financial element, something is at stake. So it becomes meaningful. And I think this is where, not just in terms of value, this is where when you have a property and there is a stake at risk, then it's not just reputation, that's something on top, but it's also something you could lose or it could affect you. You are more careful about it. So for instance, when I think about essentially people giving tokens or trading tokens, I don't think of it only in the concept of financial value. I think of it as an exchange of some form of social exchange and credibility. If I'm actually trading the token a lot, I'm actually giving credibility to the ecosystem of that token. I'm not actually just sort of delivering it for financial gain. I'm giving it credence, and therefore I'm raising its trust and reputation, and then other people see it as well. For instance, if one of us may hold a certain length of tokens and it's known, we're actually lending our credibility to that ecosystem inadvertently, right? So all of these things come into effect. I had this wonderful conversation about, like we look at financial transactions as sort of like money moving from A to B, but there's always a reason behind why that money is moving, right? There's an intention. Exactly, there's an intention, but it could be as simple as like paying a friend back for a dinner that they might have paid for you, to like works of art or like the Birkin bag, as you mentioned. And it's one other way to think of it is a kind of exchange of energy, which basically then creates a social connection. So if I have to pay you back some money, or I bought you a gift with something that I paid money for, what I'm actually doing is I'm forging a deeper connection with you, right? When you take people out for dinner, you have different types of connections. Like we all go Dutch, no pun intended, or we end up going and I pay for the dinner. And then next time you pay for my dinner. Actually, we're using money as a way to basically deepen our social interactions. And I actually think that's how we use money most of the time. I think of it, therefore, as a very social system. And tokenization basically simply makes this available for everything. That's interesting. There's maybe a secondary thing there. Obviously, you launched the Mochaverse, which is obviously like a lot of cultural capital that essentially comes together. Correct. How is that experience so far? I mean, it's still early, right? And it's developing. But the real vision behind Mochaverse is around the digital ID, where we want to basically create a reputation layer that can sit across any chain, including something like Cardano, for instance. We think that will solve a lot of problems in Web3 because, in Web3, we are quite obsessed about trustlessness and permissionlessness. And I understand for all the right reasons. But I think we've forgotten the reason we do this, and we started to attach ourselves too much about the idea of anonymity, when I think what we seek is privacy. Right? Which is a slightly different nuance towards it. Because if you live in a society where every person is anonymous and you never know who that person is, actually there is no trust. And when there is no trust, which is kind of what's happening in Web3, then everything you do has to have collateral. Right? So whereas if you can build reputation, then I can actually do business with you and I can trust you on the basis of not having to post collateral, which is basically how unsecured credit works, which is, a multi-trillion-dollar market. But more importantly, actually, if I have trust and I build reputation over time, then I won't want to lose it. And actually, this is how I think we deal with all the scammers. Because I'm going to want to work with someone who attests positive reputation on it rather than someone who's going to defraud you. And in Web2, we have primitive versions like seller and buyer ratings. When you use Uber, 5-star, 4.5, whatever star, that's kind of a version, but it's super primitive. But what we're talking about is a reputation system. And we're trying to basically make that something that's much more diverse. And because we have 540 plus portfolio companies, we aim to have them attest reputation into those IDs. And what's really fascinating, of course, is, and we see this in real life, when you build a reputation, you don't want to lose it, right? And that's something you invest in. Whereas unfortunately, Web3, people go airdrop farming from one system to another system. And, the mental image to me is it's like literally locusts going from one field to another, basically sort of ravaging the field and moving on,
Yeah.
and it becomes a wasteland. And that's actually what happens to tokens
Yeah.
that launch, because these aren't users. They're not building in the network. Because majority of them were bots.
Yeah.
Right? And that's actually, in the digital space, why IDs are so important.
Yeah.
It's not just to test that you're human.
Mm-hmm.
It's also to test whether you are a good human for what you're building, which is what we need for society.
Yeah. This is actually really interesting. So I think it was last year or 2 years ago, we did like a research on, like what motivated somebody to use a dApp. And one of the things that we found is that on average, people spend anywhere between 6 to 12 hours researching the dApp and like their reputation and their credibility before they actually wanted to interact with it. Mm-hmm. And I tied that back to the Uber example, right?
Yes.
Like the Web2 example. Can you imagine that you spend 12 hours researching your Uber driver? Like the whole e-commerce system would like break apart.
And by the way, there is an interesting sort of philosophical thought, which I think will happen around IDs and reputation, because the reputation doesn't necessarily have to be human. Meaning that you could have an AI agent or you could have a dApp, an application that functions that can have reputation too. I mean, that's how brands work, right? So and they become autonomous with AI and they can live forever on blockchain, for instance. Okay. So there's some interesting constructs there. But because they act a certain way, you can trust them because over time, they have a reason to also make sure that their reputation is built a certain way, right? Because it's basically self-preserving. It's all about basically how do you best survive in this ecosystem by preserving your reputation, because otherwise there will be no transactions. There's a lot of interesting things that can come from that. Yeah. And I think this is the point about when we talk about sort of building trust. Yeah. I don't know that it is as important to know whether he's human or not on the other side. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, that's critical for certain things. Mm-hmm. But for instance, we are on DEXs and we deal with bots all the time. When we're trading, that's not a human on the other side. But, we trust the DEX that we're using, right? It's a piece of software, right? And again, so we're already outsourcing a trust that way. We just need to know, basically not do 12 hours of research, but basically just have a certificate that basically says, I can trust that because everyone else says so, or people that I trust in my friend network say so. Yeah. And, blockchain, because of zero knowledge proofs, can do so without necessarily even revealing your identity, or you can only do it with certain parts. Yeah. And then it's enough for you to know he's trustworthy.
Yeah. It's the same identity. You don't necessarily need to know all the details behind it, but it's the same identity.
And you might even not even know the name. Yeah. You could even basically come in quasi-pseudonymously, but now you know that sort of through the ID system that actually is still trustworthy.
Yeah, exactly. ID attestations.
That's right.
If you have enough of them, then you gather your reputation and your trust.
That's right.
Amazing. I think we're roughly at like the 30 minutes. But thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's been very interesting.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you around again.
I look forward to being here again. Thank you for the invite.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Cardano. For more insights and deep dives into the world of blockchain, don't forget to subscribe and reach us at cardanofoundation.org, where you'll find extra resources and content on all things blockchain. Leave us a review wherever you enjoy podcasts. Follow us on social media and stay tuned for more coming soon.